and look at acid-base balance. So this is our final packet here for the renal system. And really, this is a combination of two packets. So if you remember in the respiratory system, we had that final respiratory acid-base balance packet. I've taken the slides from that packet, and I've taken the slides from what we have as the urinary system acid-base balance, and I've combined them into one PowerPoint where we can look at the overall acid-base balance. And this is kind of a good way to look at, to combine these two topics because they're really going hand in hand, right? The respiratory system is working hand in hand with the renal system in order to balance our acid base in the blood, okay? So it's kind of nice that we kind of left this off as a part of Unit 2, and we can combine it with this, this part of the renal system to make it make a little bit more sense, because they're really combined. They're kind of inseparable. So we'll talk about the pH, different acid-base disturbances, and then how the respiratory system works to start, and then later on we'll look at the renal system. So the pH disturbances in the blood happen anytime there is a pH that is outside of the window of 7.35 to 7.45. So in terms of our pH scale, we can have a pH that reads anything from 0, which is really acidic, to anything that's about 14, which is really basic or alkaline. And so the respiratory and renal system, basically the lungs and kidneys, work to keep the pH at this very narrow window between 7.35 and 7.45. The pH is very important to be kept at this narrow window. If we have even the slightest change of pH outside of this window, there are large physiologic consequences, okay? Very, very important that we keep our pH in this window. If we have a pH that is less than 7.35, that means we've got lots of hydrogen ions, and that means we have lots of acid or acidity in the blood. That is called acidosis, or an acidotic state. If we have a pH that is greater than 7.45, that is decreased hydrogen ions in the blood. That is going to be a decreased acidosis or alkalosis, or an alkalotic state. Okay. So again, pH that goes above 8.0 or below 6.8 can be fatal almost immediately, okay? And then changes that are not quite at this level, but probably above 7.45 or below 7.35, although not fatal, there will be huge physiologic consequences, okay? But above this window, it can be fatal very quickly. And this comes down to understanding the nature of our proteins. So proteins need to be in a specific environment in order to maintain their shape and their function. And a part of that is having a pH around 7.35 to 7.45. Anything outside of that, we begin to denature our proteins and they lose their function as a part of losing their shape. Things like hemoglobin, things like myoglobin, any protein that you can think about. It loses its shape and its function if it's exposed to a pH that is outside of that 7.35 to 7.45 window. And so there are lots of physiologic consequences as a part of that acid-base disturbance. Acidosis, a state of having too much hydrogen ions or too much acid in the blood or plasma, can create symptoms like depression of the central nervous system. A patient that's acidotic will usually present with confusion, fatigue, sometimes sleepiness, tiredness, lack of appetite, just signs and symptoms of a depressed or withdrawn central nervous system activity. Whereas on the other hand, a patient with alkalosis will have hyperactivity of the central nervous system, and such a patient will present with things like tremors, muscle spasms, sometimes nausea, vomiting, numbness, tingling, spasms of the muscles or of other parts of the body. And so this is going to be signs of increased activity or hyperactivity of the nervous system. So these are the physiologic consequences that we talk about if we have a disturbance in our acid-base balance, right? A disturbance in our pH. Okay, now we want to point out two important buffers that kind of prevent these pH changes. So hemoglobin is one of those buffers. Hemoglobin functions as a buffer by binding up some of that excess hydrogen ion and preventing any changes in the blood pH. Okay, so hemoglobin is one of our buffers. And when we talk about a buffer is anything that prevents or resists the change in pH, right? You can kind of write that down as a definition for a buffer. A buffer is any molecule or substance that prevents or resists any pH change, and hemoglobin is one of our buffers, one of our physiologic buffers that binds up or kind of mops up or acts like a hydrogen ion sponge and soaks up that excess hydrogen ion and resists any change to our blood pH. Now, the deoxyhemoglobin state, so the state of hemoglobin when it doesn't have oxygen, is the state where it has its maximum affinity for binding up those excess hydrogen ions. And so that's going to facilitate hemoglobin binding hydrogen ions when it's in the periphery, when it's in the tissues where it does not have oxygen bound to it. Another important buffer, this is probably the most important buffer that we'll talk about, is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate acts as a chemical sponge or a buffer in this way. It can bind hydrogen ions, it can bind hydrogen ions, creating this carbonic acid, and then that can dissociate into carbon dioxide and water, okay? So in this way, it will resist any changes by soaking up or mopping up those excess hydrogen ions and resisting any change to our pH, which is basically protecting our plasma, protecting our cellular environment from being exposed to the excess acid. Remember, CO2 is a respiratory acid. So this is the way that the respiratory system can lose that excess acid by blowing it off as CO2. And this ties into our ventilation, okay? If you're ventilating at a rate that is increased, you're gonna lose a lot of that CO2, and that is a mechanism for the lungs to get rid of excess acid from the body by increasing the ventilation and blowing that CO2 off. On the other hand, if you decrease your ventilatory rate, that's a way of holding on to CO2 and increasing your acid. And so that can also help in regulating the acid base as well by changing the ventilation in order to either lose more CO2 or to hold on to more CO2. And we can see in this little bit of, in this schematic here, we can see how exactly carbonic acid and bicarbonate are kind of keeping the balance. Right? They're keeping the balance of the pH and keeping it in this window of 7.35 to 7.45. If we lose carbonic acid, then bicarbonate takes over, and this pulls our lever towards the alkalotic side. Whereas if we lose bicarb, then acid takes over, right? CO2 takes over, and that pulls our lever towards the acidotic side. But if we have both of these things in this nice steady balance, this keeps our pH in this window of 7.35 to 7.45, which is normal for our cells. Okay, now this brings us to speaking about this Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. And this is a bit more complex than we're going to really go into, so I don't want you to be worried too much about this equation. But this equation importantly represents the relationship between bicarbonate and CO2 in order to keep our pH at an ideal range between that 7.35 to 7.45 window. So if we look at this relationship, the pH in our blood should be equal to 6.1, which is a constant, plus the log of the bicarb concentration divided by the CO2 concentration. And so what I want you to deduce from this equation, from this relationship, is that in order to keep our arterial blood pH at 7.4, which is within that window that we need it to be at, the ratio of bicarb to CO2 must be 20 to 1. Okay, must be 20 to 1. And so in order to do that, in order to keep that 20 to 1 ratio, the respiratory system regulates the CO2 and the kidneys regulate the bicarb. Okay, so the respiratory system helps to keep the CO2 within that ratio, and the kidneys help to keep the bicarb within that ratio. And together, this is what I mean by talking about the kidneys and lungs working together hand in hand. Together, they keep that ratio at 20:1, which keeps our pH in the blood between 7.35 and 7.45. Alrighty. So we can speak about different acid-base disturbances. So basically, if we throw the system out of whack, if we lose our balance, either because the kidneys are not doing their job or because the lungs are not doing their job, we can get into a state of acidosis or alkalosis, depending on which of those was thrown out of balance. Now, if the lungs are the causative agent, if the lungs are the reason that we have this disturbance, we're going to call it a respiratory disturbance, okay? I'll say that again. If we lose this acid-base balance, we're going to call that either an acidosis or an alkalosis. But if the reason, if the causative agent, if the lungs are what are contributing to this disturbance, we're going to call that a respiratory disturbance. And so we can have a respiratory acidosis or a respiratory alkalosis. A respiratory acidosis will be if we have an increase in CO2, meaning that we have a decrease in our ventilation. And I want you to think about this in terms of your own breathing. So if you're decreasing your rate of ventilation, you're not blowing CO2 off at a rate that CO2 is being created, you're going to start to hold on to that CO2. You're going to increase your CO2. You're going to increase your acid. That is called a respiratory acidosis. Okay. Likewise, on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, if you increase your rate of ventilation, so think about things like a panic attack, you're hyperventilating, you're blowing CO2 off more quickly than CO2 is being made or produced, you're going to decrease your CO2, which is decreasing your acid, which is putting you into a state of respiratory alkalosis, okay? So the disturbance we can call an acidosis or an alkalosis, but because it's being generated by our ventilation, because it's being generated by our lungs, we're going to call it a respiratory acidosis or a respiratory alkalosis. Okay. Okay, so that's the first part of this. That's kind of talking about how the lungs play into all of this. We're going to move on to the second part of this, which is basically the renal slides, and talk about how the kidneys contribute to this acid-base disturbance as well. We're going to start by looking at the interaction between fluid and electrolyte, and then talk about the acid-base balance and some of the disturbances that are caused from the kidney end of things. So on this slide, we're making the connection between fluid and electrolyte, okay? Fluid and electrolyte. And this is a relationship that I've been stressing, right? The fact that water follows sodium. And so if we increase our solute reabsorption, we therefore increase this osmotic pull for water to follow, right? Water follows sodium. And so we want to talk about these three hormones that we've spoken about before, but some of their other roles in connecting that water and sodium balance, that fluid and electrolyte balance. So I've put here in brackets also because I don't want you to confuse this, right? Students often confuse this as being the primary function of these hormones. These are not the primary function of these hormones. We've already talked about the primary functions of these hormones. But what we want to make is the connection between some of the secondary functions of these hormones that connect sodium and water balance, right? So ADH we've talked about extensively. We looked at ADH. Its main job was to increase water reabsorption, right? Inserting those aquaporin 2 channels into the apical membrane and facilitating the movement of water from the tubule into the blood. So the main role of ADH is increasing water reabsorption. But ADH also increases the number of sodium channels in the apical membrane of those cells. Meaning that although the primary role of ADH is to increase water reabsorption, ADH also facilitates sodium reabsorption. And that's the connection between water and sodium that we're trying to make here, right? Wherever water goes, sodium follows. So if something increases water reabsorption, as a part of its secondary job, it's also going to increase sodium reabsorption. Likewise, angiotensin 2 and ANP, their main role was for sodium balance, for sodium regulation. We talked about angiotensin 2 as increasing sodium reabsorption, and we talked about ANP as decreasing sodium reabsorption. But they also have a role to play in ADH as well, in ADH secretion as well. And because they play a part in ADH secretion, they are also playing a part in water reabsorption. So angiotensin 2 increases ADH secretion, and in brackets here in your notes, you can put increases water reabsorption. We know the role of ADH is to increase water reabsorption. Whereas ANP decreases ADH secretion, and so ANP also decreases water reabsorption. And so the connection I want you to make here is that anything that increases ADH secretion, anything that increases sodium reabsorption also increases water reabsorption. And anything that decreases sodium reabsorption also decreases water reabsorption. Again, that connection between sodium and water, right? If we're moving sodium, water will follow. So these hormones that influence sodium reabsorption, such as ADH, also influence water reabsorption, and the reverse is true for these hormones that influence ADH reabsorption. They're gonna, ADH secretion, which is water reabsorption, they're gonna also influence sodium reabsorption. Okay, those two things are tied together hand in hand. All right, this is often a confusing slide, so I'll pause here to see if there are any questions, but hopefully putting also in brackets here kind of clarifies that confusion. Alrighty. Okay, so we can also speak about the response to hemorrhage. So a part of the physiologic response to hemorrhage or to losing excess blood volume is one, to decrease the blood volume, which is decreasing the mean arterial pressure. Two, we're going to increase the neurocontrol to the heart, right? Remember that baroreceptor reflex. If we decrease our mean arterial pressure, we're going to decrease stretch on those baroreceptor reflexes. That is going to send a signal to increase the heart rate, increase the stroke volume in order to correct that mean arterial pressure. And then a third response is going to be a more long-term response, which is controlling the blood volume by secreting ADH. ADH, as we just explained extensively, is going to facilitate water reabsorption, also helping to correct that blood volume dysfunction. And then the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, which is facilitating sodium reabsorption, again, in an effort to help correct that drop in blood pressure and to raise the blood pressure and restore the mean arterial pressure. So the hormonal control here is doing two things. ADH secretion, which is facilitating water reabsorption, but also the RAS system, which eventually results in aldosterone secretion, which is facilitating sodium reabsorption. Again, that water-sodium connection, which helps to restore blood pressure, okay? That connection I talked about earlier with sodium, water, blood pressure, right? Sodium, water, blood pressure. All right, and then the second objective we're gonna go on to is speaking about the influence of the acid-base balance, and then talking about those buffers once again, and then how the kidneys and lungs work to correct any of those disturbances. So this slide is a lot of repetition from what we talked about, right? This window that the pH needs to be at, the fact that if we go outside of that pH window, we can end up with some really significant physiologic complications. That is because we denature proteins, and we talked about acidosis as being a state of depression of our nervous system, alkalosis as being a state of excitability of our nervous system. But we also want to make the connection to potassium balance, okay? So if you're in a state of acidosis, automatically that puts you at a state of hyperkalemia, okay? Excess hydrogen ions facilitates excess potassium ions. Whereas if you're in a state of alkalosis, that puts you in a state of hypokalemia. Decrease in hydrogen ions creates a state of decrease in potassium ions, because hydrogen ions and potassium ions kind of go with each other, right? Potassium loves to follow those hydrogen ions around. So if you lose acid, you lose potassium. If you have excess acid, you have excess potassium. And so this is why we need to keep our pH balance. This is another reason we need to keep our pH balance, because we also need to keep our potassium balanced. If we have potassium going out of balance, this can put us in some other physiologic complications, such as cardiac arrhythmias and vasodilation. In fact, if any of you have ever heard of, I forget what they call it, a lethal injection. So the lethal injection, which is a part of capital punishment. So if you are sentenced to die via lethal injection, a part of that process is administering potassium. So potassium concentration or potassium solution is what the lethal injection is, right? If you have excess potassium, this can create a situation where you disrupt the electrical activity of the heart and the heart pretty much stops, right? So that is how deadly excess potassium can be, and this is why it's important to regulate acid-base balance, because acid-base balance then has consequences for potassium balance. Alrighty. So here we can see some of the inputs of acid to our physiology, right? We've got proteins, which are acidic in their nature. We've got fats, which are acidic in their nature. And so the more protein and the more fat we intake in our diet, the more acidity we put into our blood. Likewise, we have metabolic processes which are releasing these acidic byproducts, carbon dioxide being one of the major byproducts of cellular respiration, lactic acid being a byproduct of muscle metabolism, and then keto acids being a byproduct that is quite acidic as well. So if you're not using glucose as your main source of fuel, let's say you're on a ketogenic diet, or if you're using mainly fats as your fuel, the breakdown product of fats is these keto acids like hydroxybutyric acid and so on, and they are quite acidic. So these are the things that contribute to having quite an acidic state in the blood, and so we need to balance these through the kidneys and through the lungs. So the kidneys have the ability to secrete hydrogen ions and lose it in the urine. And the lungs have the ability to blow off excess CO2, again, losing it through excess ventilation, blowing it off through the lungs. And so these are two ways that we can lose some of the acidity that may begin to build up in the blood. And we talked about some of the different trends of the kidneys. We talked about some of the ions that were secreted. Let's go back to this slide here. So in one of our previous packets, we talked about this table. And I didn't stress too much on you memorizing these, but I talked about the trend that shows up in terms of what's being moved across what part of the tubule. And we talked about the ability for the proximal tubule, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct to secrete these hydrogen ions. That is to lose it into the urine, to lose it into the tubular fluid. And so this is a part of that acid-base balance, the ability of the kidneys to secrete hydrogen ions and to lose that excess hydrogen, which is acid, into the urine. Another trend that I pointed out was the ability of the proximal tubule to reabsorb a lot of the important substances, and bicarb is one of those important substances. So the ability of the proximal tubule to reabsorb bicarbonate is another way that the kidneys can regulate our acid-base balance. So basically the kidneys can lose excess acid by secreting it into the urine, or it can reabsorb base, right? Bicarbonate is an alkaline substance or a basic substance. And if we reabsorb that, we can also help to regulate our acid-base balance. Okay. So let's talk about some of the sources of acid-base disturbances, basically how we can cause these disturbances. First off, we want to understand that carbon dioxide is a biologic acid. I keep mentioning that. So if we change our rate of ventilation, we can change our rate of losing or holding on to acid. And so the lungs and our breathing rate is one way of bringing about these acid-base disturbances. And we talked about these a little bit earlier in this packet. And so we want to maintain our respiratory rate by maintaining the respiratory chemoreceptor reflex. And if we do not do that, right, if we have any type of acid-base disturbance, the lungs can cause those disturbances, but the lungs can also work to correct disturbances, okay? So if you have acid-base disturbance, let's say you have an excess diet that has lots of fats, lots of proteins, and so you have more acid coming into your system, this is going to be a trigger for these respiratory centers, these chemoreceptor reflexes that pick up that excess acidity in your blood, and they are going to trigger the lungs to increase your ventilation to blow some of that CO2 off. So whereas the lungs can create acid-base disturbances, the lungs can also work to correct acid-base disturbances as well. And so if we increase our plasma CO2, we're going to be in a state of respiratory acidosis, holding on to that acid or that CO2. And if we decrease our plasma CO2, we're going to be in a state of respiratory alkalosis, which is losing too much of that acid and putting us into an alkalotic state. Let's speak about the metabolic disturbances, okay? So earlier I talked about the fact that if it's being created in the lungs, we call it a respiratory imbalance or a disturbance. If it is being created anywhere outside of the lungs, so in your diet, if you're doing lots of exercise and generating lots of lactic acid, any cause of a disturbance that is not created through the lungs, we're going to call it a metabolic disturbance. And so we can speak about a metabolic acidosis as a state of gaining excess hydrogen ions or losing excess bicarbonate ions. And this can be brought about by a few different ways, but not through the lungs. So anything other than CO2 will contribute to a state of metabolic acidosis. That can be a high protein diet, that can be a high fat diet, lots of exercise, again, creating more lactic acid. That can be a severe diarrhea. So if we have a lot of diarrhea going on, we lose some of that bicarbonate acid through the feces, through that watery component of the feces. And then renal dysfunction can contribute to that as well. Remember, I talked about the fact that the kidneys have the ability to secrete hydrogen ions into the urine and reabsorb bicarbonate ions in the proximal tubule. So if the kidneys are not working properly, if there's dysfunction of the kidneys, we're going to hold on to excess hydrogen ions if we're not able to secrete them, and we're going to lose excess bicarbonate if we're not able to reabsorb it, and that can contribute to a metabolic acidosis as well. We can also talk about a metabolic alkalosis on the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a disorder where we have excess loss of hydrogen ions or gain of bicarbonate ions. So this is happening, again, any way that has happened, any way that is creating this disturbance that is not involving the lungs, anything other than the involvement of CO2. This can be excessive vomiting, right? The stomach is holding a lot of acid, a lot of these stomach contents is highly acidic, and so vomiting is a way for us to lose hydrogen ions. That can contribute to a metabolic alkalosis. Consumption of alkaline products like baking soda, magnesium citrate, which some people kind of drink for like upset stomach, that can also contribute to metabolic alkalosis. So you want to be careful with some of those alkaline products that you may be ingesting. They can be throwing your acid-base balance out of whack. And then finally, renal dysfunction. And a more correct term here would be renal hyperfunction, not so much dysfunction. So you want to get specific here, and maybe you can put this in your notes, renal hyperfunction. So because the kidneys have a natural ability to lose hydrogen ions, right, secrete hydrogen ions into the urine and reabsorb bicarbonate ions across the proximal tubule, if you have an increase in this function or hyperfunction of the kidneys, you can lose excess hydrogen ions if they're secreting too much hydrogen ions, or if you're reabsorbing too much bicarbonate ions, that too many bicarbonate ions, that can also contribute to that metabolic alkalosis. So really a renal hyperfunction would more correctly contribute to this metabolic alkalosis. Okay, I see a question pop up here, so I'm gonna pause here for a second. Okay, so I got a good question. How is carbon dioxide both an acid and a gas? So that's a really good question. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, when it's diffused in its vaporized state, it is a gas, that's correct. But in our blood, because it is acidic in nature, just the way that proteins are quite acidic because of those side chains on their makeup, their elemental makeup, it contributes to acidity in the environment when it's in our blood. So although it is a gas in its vaporized state, in the blood, it is acidic, okay? It has an acidic nature that makes our blood acidic, okay? So those two things are not mutually exclusive. Something can be a gas and also be acidic. But that was a good question. See if there are any other questions. Okay, I don't see anything else. All right. Okay. So here we're going to look at the defense mechanisms against acid-base disturbances. So we talked about 4 disturbances, 2 that were caused in the lungs, that's respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, and then 2 that were created by any other means outside of the lungs, and that was metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. Here we're going to speak about how the body has 3 mechanisms to kind of defend us against these acid-base disturbances. And there are 3 lines of defense. The first one is the buffering of those hydrogen ions. And I talked about a buffer earlier on, and I said that a buffer was anything that kind of resists or limits any change in pH. And we talked about 2 buffers. One was hemoglobin, specifically the deoxyhemoglobin, and the other one was bicarbonate. More importantly, bicarbonate. Now, buffers can limit the change in pH, so they can kind of prevent any changes in pH, but they do have their limitation. They cannot reverse existing changes in pH. So if you are in a state of these disturbances, if you are actively in respiratory acidosis or in a metabolic alkalosis, a buffer is not going to help you. A buffer is going to prevent or limit a situation from getting worse. It's going to prevent excess changes in the blood pH, but it's not going to correct or reverse or compensate for any existing acid-base disturbances. So the buffering is really probably the first line of defense, and it's really only good at limiting changes, but not at correcting changes. The other 2 mechanisms are much better at correcting or compensating for any existing changes or any existing acid-base disturbances. And the first one is going to be the lungs, which can reverse changes in the pH by changing our ventilation. So this is what I kind of talked about earlier. The lungs can kind of kick in and compensate for any changes that are happening by adequately or appropriately regulating our ventilation, either increasing it or decreasing it to lose or hold on to more acid. And then the kidneys can also play a part in compensating any existing disturbance as well. So the kidneys are going to either secrete more hydrogen ions and reabsorb more bicarb, or the kidneys can secrete less hydrogen ions and reabsorb less bicarb. So we talked about the 2 roles of the kidneys in terms of acid base. The kidneys have the ability to secrete hydrogen ions through the proximal tubule, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. And they also have the role of reabsorbing bicarbonate through the proximal tubule only. So as a mechanism of regulating our acid base, the kidneys can increase their rate of secretion of hydrogen ions and increase their rate of reabsorption of bicarbonate. They can also decrease the rate of secretion of hydrogen ions and decrease the rate of reabsorption of bicarb, depending on whatever the acid-base balance looks like. Okay, so here we've got, this is pretty much a bit of repetition from what we talked about before, but we're talking about some of the main buffers. In our extracellular fluid, the main buffer is bicarbonate. Okay, I talked about hemoglobin being one, but bicarb is probably the more important buffer in terms of our extracellular fluid. And that is going to bind up some of this excess hydrogen ions and buffer pH changes in the extracellular fluid. Inside our cells, the main buffers are proteins, so whatever proteins are inside our cells, as well as phosphates. So proteins and phosphates have the ability to bind the excess hydrogen ions and kind of soak them up or mop them up, and again, resist any changes to the pH inside the cells. So our main extracellular buffer is bicarbonate, and our intracellular buffers are going to be things like proteins and phosphates. Okay, now we get to speaking about the respiratory compensation. So this is how the lungs can kick in and compensate or correct any acid-base disturbance. And this is usually a short-term or immediate form of compensation. This takes anywhere from minutes to maybe an hour or so, so very short term in terms of having an effect. And this is brought about by regulating or varying our ventilation. So if we're in a state of, let's say, acidosis, the kidneys will kick in and they will increase the ventilation so that we can increase our rate of breathing and we can blow off more of that CO2 more quickly, and we can decrease our plasma CO2 levels, which will effectively decrease our acidity in the blood and bring our pH back to normal. On the other end of the spectrum, if we're in an alkalotic state, if we're in an alkalosis, meaning we have too little acid and too much base or too much bicarb, the kidneys, again, can chip in. They can vary or decrease our rate of ventilation so that we're not blowing off CO2 as quickly. We're holding on to that CO2, which is basically holding on to that acid, that acidity, and we can correct our pH, bringing it back to where it needs to be. So this is that connection that I talked about with varying the rate of ventilation and correcting any underlying acid-base disturbance by either holding on to excess CO2 or blowing off excess CO2. And this is a flow chart that kind of goes through an example of that. So this is looking at a decrease in plasma pH or an acidotic state as the main stimulus here. And that is going to trigger our peripheral chemoreceptors. So remember, chemoreceptors are receptors that are in our blood that are detecting the level of chemicals. And so they're detecting the level of acidity, of hydrogen ions. And when they detect that we have a decrease in our pH, meaning that we have lots of acid or an increased acidity, lots of hydrogen ions, is another way we can represent this, they are going to send a signal to the respiratory centers, which will increase our rate of ventilation, helping us to blow off more of that CO2 more quickly, which will in turn decrease the plasma concentration of CO2, which will correct our plasma pH, and that will turn off the signal as a negative feedback loop, okay? So this is how plasma pH, whether it's acidic or basic, can be detected by the chemoreceptors, and then that can respond by varying our rate of ventilation in an effort to correct that initial plasma pH disturbance. And we can look at this scenario in the opposite as well. So while this is only looking at a decrease in plasma pH, we can think about this as happening if the reverse were true. If we had an alkalotic state, this would work to decrease the plasma pH, again, bringing us back to a stable blood pH or plasma pH. Okay. So that is how the kidneys can chip in and correct some of those acid-base disturbances. Let's talk about how the kidneys can chip in and correct those acid-base disturbances. And we're not going to go too much in detail here into the mechanism. Just in the interest of time, we're probably going to end it here. And I'm going to give you an assignment as a part of take home, but we're not going to go into the mechanism just because we don't have time, and it's not as important as understanding the overall disturbances and the overall compensations. So the third line of defense in the kidneys, this is more of a long-term regulation. So whereas the lungs can take effect, can vary the ventilation more quickly, the kidneys respond much slower. This takes anywhere from hours to days. And this regulates either by excreting hydrogen ions or by excreting bicarbonate into the urine. And so we can use the kidneys to help correct any of those acid-base disturbances as well. So the effects of an increased acidotic state, the kidneys are going to increase their rate of hydrogen ion secretion, which is losing that into the tubular fluid, which is losing that into the urine, which is losing that acid out of the body. They will also increase the rate of bicarbonate reabsorption, which is holding on to more bicarb, moving it across the proximal tubule cell and back into the blood. And again, if we are in a state of acidosis, we want to hold on to bicarbonate, which is going to help to correct that acidosis. And then a third way that the kidneys can chip in and correct disturbances is by creating new bicarbonate in the kidney. So the kidneys across the epithelial cells of the tubules, the kidneys have a way of making new bicarb. So we can reabsorb bicarb from the urine, from the filtrate, but we can also create or synthesize new bicarb as a mechanism of correcting acid-base disturbances. And again, this is only looking at states of acidity, but you want to think about this in the reverse as well. If you're in a state of excess alkalosis or excess an alkalotic state, the kidneys will do the reverse. They're going to decrease their rate of secretion of hydrogen ions, holding on to that hydrogen ion, holding on to that acidity to correct an alkalosis. They are going to decrease their rate of reabsorption of bicarb, right? If you're in an alkalotic state, you want to lose bicarb. And they're going to decrease their rate of synthesizing new bicarb. Again, if you're in an alkalotic state, you're not going to hold on to bicarb. You're going to be attempting to lose it into the urine or decrease your rate of synthesizing new bicarb. Alrighty. Okay, now the next 4 slides, again, I'm going to skip over the mechanism, which is basically these 1, 2, 3, 4 slides. So you can completely cross those off. And then the next 4 slides, which go into the compensation, so the respiratory acidosis compensation, the respiratory alkalosis compensation, and then the metabolic compensations, I want you to practice looking at a table. So I want you to practice making a table as a study tool for these compensations. And you should be able to predict, given what we talked about so far today, you should be able to predict what would the lungs do to correct a respiratory acidosis? Would they hypoventilate or would they hyperventilate? So I want you to create a table with 4 rows, right? 1 for respiratory acidosis, 1 for respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis coming down. And then across, I want you to create 3 columns. What's going to happen to ventilation? What's going to happen to hydrogen ion secretion, and what's going to happen to bicarbonate ion reabsorption. So you're going to create a table, the 4 disturbances going down, and then the 3 rows being ventilation, hydrogen ion secretion, and bicarb reabsorption, and kind of predict how the body would compensate for each of these disturbances. And I will come back during our review with a table that is what your table should look like, and we'll kind of discuss that table as a summary next week. So create that table as a part of homework, and we'll look at what your table should look like during our review next week. All right, I don't see any questions popping up here. So I'm going to assume that that was understood in terms of the instructions there. Okay, I do see a question. Okay, so you're not going to turn in the table. So I got a question, how do we turn in the table? You're not going to turn it in necessarily. It's going to be a good study tool 1. And then 2, as a part of a review, I'm going to go over what your table should look like. So you can get an idea of how well you understood or didn't understand the application of these disturbances and the compensation. Okay, so you're not going to